while the entirety of Scripture expresses itself through a variety of different genres, one of the most complex genres to address is the gospel genre. And it is complex because of a variety of factors that are unique in reference to this body of 4 books, not the least of which is the reality that there would be no category, no genre in literature or any literature studies called Gospels if it wasn't for these 4 Gospels. They make up the entirety of the genre. The reality of their presence and the closed nature of this literary field sets it apart from even the epistles. There are ancient epistles written from the Greco-Roman world of the first century. There are legal texts outside of the context of just specifically Hebrew legal texts. Poetry, there's many non-canonical expressions of poetry and wisdom literature, both Jewish and non-Jewish. But when we come to the gospel literature, they exist uniquely as a Christian genre and really have the boundaries and the conventions of the genre established specifically by the canonical Gospels. Certainly there are post-canonical or non-canonical Gospels that follow in the Christian tradition, but they are most often very different and much later. Later not necessarily being specific to the literary evaluation, but their difference in approach, many of them resemble more collections of sayings or mythological interpretations. There's something fundamentally different about the 4 Gospels that we have come to know as the literature of gospel genre. And so as we begin to explore them, there are multiple elements that we need to address. We need to talk about a definition of the genre as a whole, as well as the component literary structures and parts that contribute to making the genre. And so we'll begin by just answering and exploring the question, what is the gospel? What are the Gospels as literature? And we can approach this in a macro view and a micro view. Oftentimes, as you study the field, you're going to find that the descriptions of the Gospels as literature in genre studies focus on the component parts. But if we want to take the big view, what is it that makes up a gospel? What conventions, what structures, what focus set apart all of the canonical Gospels? We can explore what different writers have said. Many of them, and historically, oftentimes, it is described as being the genre of biography. And yet, we can define that differently. It goes without saying that these are not biographies in the way of modern biographies that take chronological and deeply explore the motivations, background of the subject matter. Ancient biographies were composed very differently. We have Greek bios, which were established and built in certain ways for certain functions. As Ryken highlights, the hero story, which really is a form of ancient Greek biography. You'll find that the descriptions of the macro view of the genres are really established by the perspective and the interpretive framework of the person making the designation. That's why you're going to find those who are more literary attuned, they're going to call it story and narrative. Those who skew to the side of historical reconstruction, you're going to have them calling it historical narrative or history, a recording of history. Some would call it a theological creation of the church. We see this in the school of religion philosophy of the 1800s, 1900s, early 1900s. This idea that the Gospels are the creation of the much later church as it was influenced by the Greek culture and the supposed conflict between the Greek church and the Jewish church. And it was the Gospels then became reading back and interpreting and establishing the Gospels in light of the ideology and the traditions already established in the church. So they don't bear historical reality as specifically giving us information about Jesus as he was. They give us much more a description of the church as it believed much later. One of the best descriptions is the Gospels as an apostolic memoir. Well, all of these can be thrown together and pulled together to give us some sense of the description. If we were to try to unpack that, for me, there are several things that are absolutely critical if you're going to build a view of the gospel as literature. Number one, they are unique in that they are Christocentric. Every one of the Gospels are uniquely focused on the person of Jesus and his identification as the Messiah. And so, whether it's biography, it is most certainly set apart clearly by its specific focus on Jesus as the Messiah. It's also missional, and this is a point that I think comes out very effectively in those who view these from a rhetorical perspective and rhetorical criticism. The Gospels are not history in the sense of recording events, not just an exposition of history with details and dates and times and order. It's much more nuanced than that. In fact, it is very specifically these Gospels and the Gospels as literature were written with a purpose. They were written to defend or lead people to a point of decision and to be transformed by their encounter with Jesus. And so it has the sense of literature because of the shaping of the texts, each one individually for the audience to which it was being sent, with the purpose of accomplishing the mission of Christ. So not only are they Christocentric, but they are not bare detailing of historical fact. They are intentionally shaped for the mission of people encountering and coming to know or coming to live out the message of Jesus. The literature is also unified. Unified most specifically in their individual expressions. Clearly, as we talk about the synoptics, they can be read across each of the three synoptic gospels because of the overlap of material. And so in that sense, they are somewhat unified. But this is more specifically in the vertical readings, as Fee and Stewart would point us to, or even a critical scholar like Bart Ehrman speaks of being able to read both vertically and horizontally through these synoptic gospels. The vertical nature of the text speaks to us of the cohesive purpose of each of the gospel authors. Sometimes they clearly say it. John tells us why he's writing his gospel, so that you could believe that he was the Son of God. Luke exposes to us his purpose, that he was writing an orderly record, an orderly historical account of Jesus. So whatever the purposes are, we can see the construction of the individual Gospels being coherent and unified for their purpose. And so I think this becomes a core part of the Gospel genre as literature, because they are shaped and formed with clear authorial intent and purpose. And that brings a cohesion, a unity to the text. They are not randomly thrown together. This is one of the reasons we see things mentioned in one part of the narrative, maybe in Matthew, and it's recorded in a different way, in a different setting, at a different time seemingly, in Luke's gospel. That speaks to the fact that within their own expression, they are unified for their purpose. Now, for me, if I were going to zoom all the way out and give a clear expression of a definition of the literature genre called Gospels, I would say they are theologically interpreted historical records, and they are shaped profoundly according to the distinct literary intentions of the authors. It's not enough to call them history. It's not enough to call them biographies. They're unlike other biographies. They're longer. They have more segments that are just not attested in biographies. So that's not sufficient. Even ancient biographies, they can't just be called narratives because they are filled with too much content and teaching to just simply be called narratives. But they are theologically interpreted historical narratives that are shaped profoundly according to the distinct literary intentions of their authors. Now, if we want to go back and look at constituent parts, the components, the many genre elements that come into it. We'll break the text down into three major categories with multiple subcategories. In the microview, we see narrative. We also see, within that setting, we see discourse. We can also see some very small elements of poetry. And often the poetry is worked into either the narrative segments or the discourse. But they can still be marked out and viewed separately and interpreted uniquely because of that. In the narrative sections, we find a whole array of scholarly designations of different types of narrative expression. And they can be interpreted at some levels within these specific genres of narrative expression. Encounter stories. These are captured in the text where a person encounters Jesus and has oftentimes dialogue. The story of Jesus with Nicodemus would be an encounter story. One of the most unique and prevalent in the Synoptic Gospels, or even also in the Gospel of John, are what are called pronouncement stories. They go by different names by different scholars. Some call them paradigm stories. Others call them conflict stories. They're these encounters, and they're narratives where Jesus has an experience, oftentimes in dialogue or conflict with an individual. But the real point of the story is the final saying, often expressed in the ways of a wisdom literature kind of expression, aphorisms, different things, these sayings that kind of sum up the encounter. It's almost as if the gospel writer establishes and tells the narrative for one specific purpose, and that is to bring out this particular saying. Memorable, pithy oftentimes. And so the story of Jesus with the Samaritan woman at the well is one of those. Obviously they have a long and pronounced dialogue going on there in John chapter 4. But at the end, we find several of these kind of sayings, these pronouncements, these establishments of a paradigm perspective that are laid out in the text. When Jesus says, but the hour is coming and is now here when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for the Father is seeking such people to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. That last sentence of that block of text right there, God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth, give the features of a pronouncement story. Long dialogue, interaction, narrative story captured with one final pointed saying. Miracle stories, and obviously in all four of the Gospels we find the very extended part of the narrative being the Passion story. Beyond that narrative context, the Gospels encounter and engage in discourse to varying degrees depending on the intention of the individual author. But in the discourse sections, we find a variety of different methodologies that the scripture writer uses. We see oratories. These are defined as longer blocks of uninterrupted speech. They tend to be more intentionally arranged, more highly organized, more deliberate in their utilizing of rhetorical methodologies. The most clearly known of all of the great oratories is Matthew's recording of what we call the Sermon on the Mount. Long body of text, very highly organized, moving orderly through the presentation. There are other oratories that they're Jesus just specifically of himself speaking, but much more briefly expressed. These brief discourses have the same kind of elements as an oratory, but they're just much more compressed. Then beyond that, we find discourse presented and shaped by the authors, by the idea of dialogue. It's really an expression of Jesus teaching and him in a didactic setting, but it is framed within the context of an interaction and an ongoing dialogue. One of those will be what we look at as our sample literary study of Luke chapter 11. It's a dialogue, a dramatic dialogue between Jesus and the disciples on the theme of prayer. Parables would be placed within the context of discourse. You will find more contemporary literature trying to wrestle through the realities of the parables than on almost any other micro genre expressed within the Gospels. There has been a wide range, and one of the reasons we see so much contemporary writing on it is coming out of modernity and the agendas of the more historical criticisms. You find that they had a very distinct shaping of their view of the parables, against which we've seen a really dramatic reaction and rejection of those expressions of the Enlightenment trying to wrestle with the parables. We also find discourses, farewell discourses, which was a fairly well defined category of discourse in the world at that time, but even more so, we find it in Jewish literature in the Second Temple period. We find entire segments of literature, entire books that are written really as farewell discourses. It becomes a key way to express kind of climactic teaching from the person sharing it before their death. Poetry, we have the Magnificat from Mary. We see other places where we see the traditional Jewish expression of poetry through Hebrew parallelism. Those show up later and can be discussed as they go. Now, I think it's important as we stop and think about the expression of the Gospels as a whole, it's in many ways the difference between a portrait and a picture. And this is worth commentary because we've come through an extended period of gospel interpretation that focused on the historical elements of the literature. What that ultimately became is a means by which to dissect, take apart, and often disregard the text as being unreliable historically. Each of the quests for the historical Jesus wrestle with the gospel text, and oftentimes they found themselves at an unfruitful conclusion because of the way they approached it historically. And the idea of the difference between a portrait and a picture, I think, is helpful for us as we examine this body of text. A picture is a snapshot in time that is very clearly and obviously and literally the person of whom the picture was taken. Of course, it can be shaped by point of view and perspective and lighting and all of that, but it is undeniably an accurate presentation of the person in the photograph. You can't deny that's them. It's objective, which is the goal of modernity's approach to interpreting the Gospels historically. They were looking for an objective way to examine the text. Now, a portrait is different. A portrait comes into being by the work of an artist who spends time with the subject, who poses the subject, who examines not just the physical appearance, but the character of the individual. And so the hope with a portrait is to give you a window into the person. Obviously, it will bear a likeness to the historical individual, but it offers us more than that. The way that they establish setting, and the background, and even issues of lighting and tone of the colors and the hues and the approach to the way that they put a feature or a look on the face. All of those things figure into the establishing of a good portrait. And so we can look at these two examples of a previous president. Each and every president is preserved in an oil painting portrait by a classic portrait artist of his generation. As we look at these two pictures, you can see the one on the right is clearly, you cannot deny that is President George W. Bush. It clearly is. It is literally true. But on the left, you can see that the portrait artist is looking for a way to draw out some character. It's trying to set even context for his presidency, for the muted back tones, no doubt dealing with the context of a post-9/11 world and the shadow of war and conflict. You can see all of the differences. And I think there's an analogy here for the way the Gospels interact with us. Those who are looking for historical literalism an objective frame to look at it, we'll be disappointed in the Gospels. And this is where there's so much conflict of, well, the Lord's Prayer in Matthew is an oratory. In Luke, it's expressed as a dialogue between the disciples and Jesus. The struggle is that the Gospel writers are not trying to present a historical literalism that does not deny that what they're relating is historically accurate. Just like a portrait of President Bush may be a fitting expression of him from a certain time in his life and his presidency, but it's not in the same way as a snapshot, a photograph. And so what we find in the Gospels are these carefully crafted, using the artistic and rhetorical abilities of the author and in the time period to create a sketch of Jesus that is true to history. It is an accurate reflection of who Jesus is and as he was in his life, but it is shaped by the tools and abilities that the writer has to carry out his objective. And so to think of the Gospels as portraits, historically accurate, but shaped and interpreted to convey something of the character, the person, the teaching, the life of Jesus, in a way different than a supposed objective historical reconstruction. So beyond the micro genres and the macro view of the overall genre, we also have the literary techniques, rhetorical techniques that show up, and there's a variety of them. These don't rise specifically to the level of a genre, but they are the component parts, the conventions that make up the genres. And we find a whole variety of these employed all throughout all four of the Gospels. We see irony, parallelism, hyperbole, metaphor, simile, figurative language, prosopoeia, which is a rhetorical skill that personalizes or speaks as if you are from that person. So this is why maybe some of the gospel writers took the core of the sayings of Jesus and some of the speeches of Jesus, but also shaped them and spoke as they were speaking for Jesus. This was an entirely appropriate manner of conveying someone's speaking, teaching, or oratory. It doesn't fit as well in our context when we are so accustomed to videotape and audible tapes and CDs that can record events. And so, but in that time period, it was not uncommon, nor was it unacceptable to put words and to speak, to draw the general framework of someone's presentation and then write it as an oratory or as a speech and supply and fill in the gaps. Allegories, repetition, aphorisms, these short, kind of punchy lines. Amplification, again, another rhetorical technique to bring around, which we will see in the example from Luke chapter 11, this almost cyclical nature of saying, re-saying, and then bringing it together again at the end. We see these techniques and multiple others in there. But if we're going to move now from a simple definition and examining of the component parts of the Gospels, we've got to move toward the different ways in which it has been explored historically. And the Gospels have been subjected to an entire range of different types of interpretive frameworks and schemes. And if we could think of it along the line of a continuum, on one end, we would have those approaches that are supremely attuned to the text itself as a literary unit. On the other extreme, we're going to explore those that are much more concerned with contextual matters. These are the approaches that look at the things around or behind the text, and in many ways disregard the text. Obviously, we could fill in a lot of these, but we're going to pull out a couple highlighted areas to explore how they have impacted the way that the gospel genre has been interpreted historically. If you want to go back to the final days of the ascendancy of modernity and modernism and the ways they would approach text, we find the emergence of new criticism or formalism that draws incredibly focused attention on the individual text as it existed. They will pull out a pericope, and they will focus all of their attention to the literary form of that text. They do it in a way that disregards almost entirely all of the surrounding background, cultural, historical matters. They view the text as an independent reality, independent of the author who penned it, independent of the audience that receives it. It is the text as an autonomous reality in and of itself, shaped by its form and manner of expression. This began outside of the context of biblical interpretation, but was brought into the field of biblical studies and had tremendous influence in the beginning of the 20th century. It is a primarily synchronic approach. It disregards, it's looking at it as it is right now without regard to its development, history, previous interpretation. It's a relatively radical approach. In fact, not relatively, it is a very radical approach to interpreting a text. Now, the problem is that as we move further across the continuum, we find some of the terminology and some of the background of new criticism being adopted and used by other critics, other scholars, other interpreters, but they are using it in a more nuanced way. They are not going to the full extreme. And the difficulty is then others who are arguing for the necessity for background and context, those who are recognizing the form of the text but not wanting to disregard all of the contextual matters, begin to attack even the more nuanced approaches. One of the more nuanced approaches would be Ryken, who we read for this class. Ryken is not approaching literature studies of the Gospels as a means by which to deny the historicity of the Gospels, nor is he using it to diminish the intention of the original author. In fact, he very clearly says in the introduction to his entire series that is in the front of every book, he is hoping to use the literary approach and literary forms to help better understand the intention of the author. This is very different than the way new criticism approached the text as an individual unit, as an autonomous unit. But there are similarities, and I may call this the evangelical literary critic, who preserves authorial intent, but is also taking a much, much more synchronic approach. Ryken does not deny the history behind the text, but he doesn't focus on it. He gives very little attention or time to it. And so he is looking at, in the narrative passages, all the variety of narrative passages, miracle stories, passion story, encounter stories. What Jesus is doing there is, what Ryken is trying to do is to explore those with a very heavy emphasis on the movement within the text and the narrative, seeing the individual episodes of the entire narrative that you're dealing with. He wants to explore that in manners of plot development, to draw out deeper attention to the characterization of the participants in the narrative. He's giving a time to the setting contained within the text. He's not as concerned about the historical setting as much as he is the setting as established and expressed specifically within the particular text. He does the same thing when he explores discourse. He's looking at the primary theme, understanding that this is a teaching passage. It's different than a narrative passage. But in these teaching passages, the task is to explore the way that the writer used literary methods to develop a primary theme within the text. He goes a little further and gives you more background and more experience with the parables because they kind of combine the two. They are a part of a discourse, but the longer parables are discourse captured within story form. So he approaches that a little bit differently. But this is a primary means. And you'll have people that immediately react against the concept of a literary approach to Scripture because they equate that to disregarding authorial intent. It is a denial of meaning, a specific meaning. Because one of the natural and undeniable consequences of new criticism was that you were set adrift and there were as many meanings as there were interpreters. That is not, as I read Ryken's intention. He is still giving us the sense that there are gaps in the narrative, there is a richness to metaphoric and figurative language. All of these things are true. There is an emotive characteristic to the literature, to the text. But that's not denying that there is meaning to be captured. It encompasses all of that meaning. That's very different than what the new critics would have done, where they left it far more open. They left it much more multivalent. And so we must be careful when we read criticism of a literary approach to not assume that an evangelical literary critic is reading it with the same intention that a classic modernistic view from new criticism and formalism would have been reading it. Now, if we move a little further over, we might include as a subset rhetorical criticism. This can be a very helpful, but it's a subset, I think, of literary criticism. It involves many of the same things, close reading of the text, understanding the flow of it. But the one area that it does significantly differ, and you can read this in somebody like Witherington. Witherington's approach to rhetorical criticism, especially New Testament, is his contention that much of the writings of the New Testament were deeply impacted by Greek forms, Hellenized forms of rhetoric. The structures, the styles, the techniques that were brought to pass through the development in the hundreds of years before the New Testament times had now infiltrated the culture and the lives and the audiences of both Jewish and Greek contexts. And so he offers that many of these gospel texts are written with specific rhetorical intentions. They are written for a purpose to persuade. And so you'll see Witherington explore the individual book of Matthew or Luke, especially Luke and Mark. He gives attention to, and he'll establish it within as an entire book within the rhetorical framework. So he's willing to look for connections and bridges between the various segments of the text, leading toward the overall persuasive impact that the author was looking for. You don't see a lot of that connecting between the various pericopes in the strictly literary approach. They look at the individual segment as it exists. Witherington wants to see much more of a macro view. Now, moving further to the right toward our context-centric types of interpretation, it's what I would call maybe more of a literary, historical, grammatical approach. There are a variety of scholars that are now writing from an evangelical perspective that are still emphasizing authorial intent. They are still emphasizing the cultural and historical background, but they are slightly to the side of beginning and focusing within the text. So you're going to hear a lot more about genre. You're going to hear about conventions and components of the individual genres in these categories, much more so in authors like Osborne in The Hermeneutical Spiral. He gives entire segments of his book over to the conventions and the manner of interpreting the different genres of Scripture, including the Gospels. You'll read this in Klein, Blomberg, and Hubbard, where they are also giving attention to much more of the text-focused. It's historical, grammatical, no doubt. They are encouraging you to engage those things, but they are also giving you much, much more emphasis on the text as it is, as a specific expression of a genre. Maybe the most significant in these is one of our textbooks, Duval and Hayes. They give us a lot of the background and literary styles and structures as it influences our interpretation. They again are looking, when they talk about crossing that principalizing bridge, there's no doubt they're bringing into it historical, grammatical, cultural, tradition studies. All of those things are present. But again, they are giving a great amount of emphasis to the literary elements as well. just slightly to the other side is someone like Fee and Stewart. Fee and Stewart do have a segment talking about the genre-specific elements of the different segments of Scripture. But even in that, they are prioritizing historical grammatical elements. In fact, they write this in their text, that the priority place to begin is in the context, history and culture. They want you to have that as the established background before you begin with the text. So you see the subtle shift from Osborne, who wants to focus on the text first, or Duvall and Hayes, or Klein, Blomberg, or Hubbard, to Fee and Stewart, who say begin with the background, have a setting that establish it, then draw in the literary. It's a subset. They view the literary elements as subsets of their historical grammatical approach. Now, moving much further to the right, we have things like form, source, redaction, criticism, which in many ways could go to the other side in the text-centric. Form criticism was originally a way to view very specifically the genres or the forms of the text. But the reason I've moved it to the far right on the context-centric is as it became practiced, regardless of their intent, as it became practiced, the scholars who developed the field, Debelius, Bultmann, they were so beholden to an underlying historical criticism and historical biases that when they approached the text, supposedly in a close reading to look for the individual form and the breaks and to discern what was original and what was not, they came with such a heavy historical bias that their work was so influenced by that it no longer kept the text as a whole. It no longer allowed you to see the text. The text disappeared behind the form criticism. And that would be true for the expressions, ultimate expressions of form criticism, source criticism, and redaction criticism as well. And so what could have been useful as close readings of the text, and the redaction criticism being that horizontal reading of the text, which should have influenced and helped us to be able to read the authorial intents of the individual scripture writers, was lost in conjecture and speculating, that was so biased by bad history that it no longer really bore any resemblance to a text approach. On the final segment of this, we look at historical criticism. These are ones that so emphasized the supposed modern approach to history that they really disregarded the text as being any form of reliable expression of history. School of Religion, History of Religion school would have been in this category. Tübingen school, as they in Germany approached the text in this way. Really, they disregarded the text as unreliable on the grounds of a particular way to view history. That solely saw the background, the context, as the defining thing. And it was, again, heavily influenced by bias. For all of their attempts to be objective, what dismantled that system as a whole was the reality is that they were not unbiased. They were entirely biased. And it's not history for history's sake, because good historical study must be used in our approach to the gospel. It was a form of history that detached the text from any ability for revelation, for miraculous. It was naturalism as a historical approach. And that's why it just doesn't work when you come to the Scripture. It certainly doesn't work for anyone who comes to the Scripture with the framework or the worldview that says that God can speak, that Jesus is the incarnate Son of God, that when it says he did miracles, that he really did do miracles. The higher criticisms from the historical framework that disregard the text dismantle it in a way that makes it unusable for those who do believe that God can speak. So as we talk about these frameworks, there are several non-negotiables, I think, that we must approach the Gospels. Number one, it must come from a framework that believes that God is present and does reveal himself. He reveals himself in his word, through inspiration, through the authors, but he also revealed himself in the person of Jesus. He is the incarnate Son of God. And if the interpretive framework begins apart from that, then it is too far on the extremes, on the polar extremes of the continuum, to really allow you to read the text as the text was intended to be read, as the authors purposed it to be read. There is the issue of authorial intent. It still matters. If the meaning of the text is solely relegated to the form of the text, or if it's entirely relegated to the readers, we've lost an acceptable way to read a text. Authors put their meaning. Now again, it's not like Schleiermacher, who wanted to explore the authorial intent through kind of a mystical union, a religious connection with the author, or his disciple Dilthey, who was going to do it through a psychoanalysis, if you will, of the author's intent. No, we are a text-centered authorial intent interpreter. We know what the authorial intent was, or we can approximate the authorial intent, not from a spiritual union or a psychological evaluation, but from a good reading of what is left for us in the text. That leads us to the third non-negotiable. It must be text-centered. I think that for all that Fee and Stewart offer us in their hermeneutics books, that statement that it must begin with background contextual matters really gets it out of order. We must begin with the text because the text is what we have. It's the one objective that does present itself to us. The text is the text, and so we should begin with the text. But that doesn't mean that we don't go to the next non-negotiable, which is that it is historically and contextually conscious. We are removed from the Gospels as they were written by 2,000 years in radically diverse cultures, written in different languages. These things demand of us that we do good historical study, good contextual study, good cultural study, that we bring the resources at our disposal to help us uncover what was happening and intended as it was originally written. So to that end, I think it leaves us with a handful of acceptable approaches in the middle of the continuum, these hybrid forms that maintain these non-negotiables, but also avoid the poles of focusing entirely on the text to the absence of history, context, culture, the author, or on the other side, a focus on the context, the history and the culture and the tradition, often artificially created by the interpreter. We reject those, and we find in the middle ground workable structures on which to locate ourselves as gospel interpreters. And so in that way, we see it as a collection of tools. We use history, we use culture, we use the canonical context, we use the grammatical studies and semantics and word studies. We understand the literary frameworks. We should engage in the Gospels of all places in the New Testament on redaction. We ought to see why the author chose to organize his text the way he did, to present it the way he did, may be different than one of the other gospel writers did. We should explore that. We should be good students of rhetorical skills that would have been employed in the first century so that we can identify the main points and the developing points of the text. And so instead of saying, I am a literary critic or I am a historical grammatic critic, I think we must view ourselves in the middle there, that we are hybrid critics that bring these as tools, because Osborne says this well. If we take any one of these individual elements and we elevate it to the full approach and the full framework, we will inevitably end with some form of error. And so I would present to us a gospel interpretive approach that embraces all of these tools, use them, and sometimes one tool will be more effective at understanding what's going on in the text than another. But we need to be proficient in all of them. And so I would present this as a way to approach. I think it needs to begin with the literature itself, begin with the text. Look at it from a literary frame. Look for the form, the plot, the theme, the characterization, the settings, all the things that a good literary approach would bring. We should do that first. Spend the primary and first time of our study on those things. Then move a step out to the grammatical relationships. This will often give us insight as to the flow and the development, and it's closely related to the literary approach. Semantics, word studies matter. We're approaching it from another language than its originating language, and we should understand what the text was doing, often giving us insight to the development and the intention. We should look at the contextual matters. After having spent a significant amount of time focused within the text, now we move to context. We look for things like historically important matters. We look for things on tradition or culture. We look for the geographical things that could influence the way this text developed. And then we can also view it within the canonical text as well, the canonical context. And then, especially in reference to the Gospels, let's do some of the horizontal reading, because that will often give us insight as to the full purpose of the author's work and choices. And then finally, we can begin to zoom out fully on the rhetorical context to see what the purpose and the persuasive intention of the author. Because these Gospels were not written to just simply be explored as historical documents. They were written as a means by which to convey and persuade the audience that would receive them about something in particular in reference to Jesus. So this is an outline of an approach to use to addressing the Gospels, and we will then take Luke 11 verses 1 through 13 as a sample study to employ this order of approach to interpret a gospel passage.